chapter on Capharnaum.
Hearing that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he went and settled in Capharnaum, beside the lake, on the borders of Zebulun and Naphtali. From then onwards, Jesus began his proclamation with the message, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is close at hand."
We are in Capharnaum, on the northwest shore of Lake Tiberias. There have been excavations in this village for 100 years. Why so much interest in this village? A sign we erected at the entrance to the ruins reads, "Capharnaum, the town of Jesus." Perhaps no other village has as many mentions in the Gospel as this one. It is a fact that Matthew, who was from Capharnaum, says that upon leaving Nazareth, Jesus went to live in Capharnaum. In Greek, he made his home there. Capharnaum, which lay along the Via Maris, the main ancient route connecting Egypt and Damascus, was a highly frequented town. This explains the presence of a detachment of soldiers under the jurisdiction of the centurion mentioned by the Gospels. Being a frontier town between the two regions ruled by Herod's sons, Capharnaum had a customs house. Here the publican Matthew exercised his profession before becoming a disciple of Jesus. Here we found a milestone. It was believed, for example, that the road to Damascus passed by Tapga toward the north, but now we know it passed through Capharnaum.
As he was walking along by the lake of Galilee, he saw Simon and Simon's brother Andrew casting a net in the lake, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Come after me, and I will make you into fishers of people." And at once they left their nets and followed him.
During his 3 years of itinerant preaching in Galilee, after he had called the 12 apostles to follow him, Jesus made Capernaum his home and the base for his public ministry. Jesus was legally considered a resident of Capernaum. In fact, it was here that he was approached by the collectors of the temple tax.
And at once, on leaving the synagogue, he went with James and John straight to the house of Simon and Andrew. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was in bed and feverish, and at once they told him about her. He went in to her, took her by the hand, and helped her up. And the fever left her, and she began to serve them.
The excavations conducted by the Franciscans in the early 20th century led to the discovery of an elegant building with polychrome mosaic flooring dating from the end of the 5th century. The structure consisted of 2 concentric octagons and an outer semi-octagon serving as an ambulatory. The identification of this building as a church was confirmed with certainty in 1968, when Father Virgilio Corbo identified the apse facing east and, inside, a baptismal font. It was then a question of determining whether this Byzantine building, used by the Christian community, was the place described by the anonymous pilgrim from Piacenza in 570.
And so we came on to Capernaum, to the house of St. Peter, which is now a basilica.
We removed the mosaics with the peacock, for example, the one that was in the central octagon, and the surprises began. An enormous amount of plaster fragments beneath the mosaic. There was the film laid to rise above the previous level. we have a church on top of another church. And this is another point, a link with the earlier period. From the Byzantine Church in the late 5th century, we go back toward the 4th century. In the 4th century, there was most certainly a structure here, which today we call, somewhat pompously, Domus Ecclesia, that is, a house used as a church, as a place of worship. It is a square room with sides about 6 meters long, divided into two by a central arch, which was repeatedly plastered and decorated with paint. Signs of visits by pilgrims centuries ago. 165 graffiti are today preserved in the Museum of the Flagellation, and they provide evidence that the Byzantine architects deliberately built the central octagon of their church exactly upon the site of a previous, highly frequented Christian place of worship. The venerated room was physically separated from the rest of the village by means of a solidly built wall 112 meters long, which enclosed it on 4 sides. Access to the inside was provided by 2 small doors. A vestibule with lime flooring on the east side and a small connecting hall marked the entrance to the venerated room. The whole complex, which formed a proper sanctuary, was visited and described by the pilgrim Egeria at the beginning of the 5th century.
At Capharnaum, the house of the Prince of the Apostles, St. Peter, has become a church, but the walls of the house are still standing as they were in the past.
She says that Peter's house was changed into a church. She adds, but its walls are still as they were in the past. This is truly precious. Exactly as we ourselves found, that is, the floors were rebuilt and covered, the walls remained intact, so much so that on these walls we later found several layers of plaster, among them pieces of plaster with graffiti, with decorations. Therefore, it has now been ascertained that what we found was the traditional House of Peter. The conversion of the venerated room into a church had already begun centuries before Egeria's time. From the end of the 1st century, the original floor of stone and packed earth was covered with at least 6 layers of white lime. This is judged to be a sign of the special attention paid particularly to this room, which can be precisely dated thanks to elements found between the layers. We suggest that as early as the 1st century after Christ, or no later than the 2nd century, this house began to enjoy a particular veneration and interest on the part of a community we know through literary sources, the Judeo-Christians of this area. From some ancient Jewish documents, and based on strong traditions endured up to the Middle Ages, we learn that Capharnaum was the dwelling place of a group of Jews known as Minim, heretics in the eyes of Orthodox Judaism, with which they had broken in order to pursue a Christian way of life. It was probably these first followers of Christ who handed down the memory of the house of Simon Peter during the first 4 centuries of the Christian era. First we began digging outside, and we found 3 stone pavements, one on top of the other. The same thing in the Sacra Insula, that is, the insula where Peter's house is traditionally located. Again, we have the 3 stone pavements, one atop the other. And these floors, with ceramics, are definitely 1st century. And beneath the oldest floor, we are in a period even before Christ, the Hellenistic period. Beneath the foundations of the octagonal church and the walls of the Judeo-Christian sanctuary, 6 closed rooms were identified, including the venerated room, with typical stone-paved floors around an open courtyard, and stairs and a furnace, as was customary. People entered through a door whose basalt stone threshold is still visible and well preserved. So, we enter from the east, cross a threshold, and around us there are houses that may very well have been used by different families. One of these houses is that little room we call the Venerated Room. Only Mark speaks of this door.
When he returned to Capernaum, some time later, word went round that he was in the house. And so many people collected that there was no room left, even in front of the door. He was preaching the word to them, when some people came, bringing him a paralytic, carried by 4 men. But, as they could not get the man to him through the crowd, they stripped the roof over the place where Jesus was. And when they had made an opening, they lowered the stretcher on which the paralytic lay.
When we talk about that paralytic lowered from the roof, no. Luke, who comes from the world of the Gentiles, speaks of roof tiles. Here we found not even half a tile. Mark, by contrast, does not say anything at all about roof tiles. They removed the roof, and we may say easily, these were only very light roofs, easy to uncover, to remove, even if there was someone underneath. A glass floor inside the present memorial enables today's visitors to enter the venerated room from above to relive the gospel episodes that took place there. All around, the view is dominated by the suggestive ruins of the ancient village of Capharnaum.
They went as far as Capernaum, and at once on the Sabbath he went into the synagogue and began to teach. And his teaching made a deep impression on them, because he taught them with authority.
The spectacular ruins of the White Synagogue, just north of the octagonal basilica, do not belong, as had been supposed in the early 20th century, to the synagogue where Jesus used to cure and teach. However, the synagogue described in the Gospel, the one built by the pagan centurion, of which Jairus was one of the chiefs, and in which Jesus promised the Eucharist in his famous sermon on the bread of life, is located on the same site. Excavations have revealed the large basalt stone floor, measuring 20 by 8 meters, at a depth of about 2 meters below the present nave. The same survey, based on the finds and a treasure of 40,000 coins recovered from below the floors, established that the monumental White Synagogue was built in the 5th century, more or less in the same period as the Byzantine Church. The last great transformation of the synagogue may be dated to no earlier than 470, because all the latest coins point to this date. The sculpted capitals, the friezes of the cornices, the variety of figures and ornamentation are a wealth beyond comparison. The building rose to a height of 2 stories and included a large prayer hall divided into aisles by a stylobate, a triportico added on the east side, and an independent balcony on the side oriented toward Jerusalem, where the most refined architecture was to be found. Along the interior plaster-coated walls, there are masonry benches for sitting and, near the entrance doors, architectonic niches for the scrolls of the scriptures and the chair of Moses, elements of which are now exhibited in the archaeological area. The basalt stone wall of the foundation of the prayer hall, visible on the west side near the cobblestone street, may correspond to the basement of a synagogue building coming between the one built by the centurion and the late 5th century Byzantine synagogue. to which the following passage from Egeria seems to refer.
There, near the house church, is also the synagogue, where the Lord cured a man possessed by the devil. The way in is up many stairs, and it is made of dressed stone.
Through the excavations, we have been able to reconstruct, I won't say all, but a good part of the history of Capharnaum, which is very long. Indeed, just a few steps from here, we have buildings with well-preserved floors, where we have found coins dating from the 15th century AD. So, on the one hand, we have findings from the 3rd millennium before Christ, up to the 15th century after Christ. And we also have an almost uninterrupted succession, especially in the Roman period, which we are most interested in, up to the period of the 10th, 11th century AD. The 12 living quarters brought to light thanks to the work of archaeologists allow us to reconstruct the community life of the village and its numerous activities. Domestic activities, whose normal setting was the courtyards of dwellings shared by several families. Crafts, including the production of glass, ceramics and stone utensils. Farming, with abundant wheat fields, palm groves and olive orchards. Trade, with export and import products. Industry, with oil presses and mills. We found this truly impressive structure, that is a public oil press. Because, in addition to the system of the millstone, on the east side we found a whole complex of rooms where each owner arrived at the public oil press and put his sack there, and later collected the oil as suited him. Many gospel episodes here find a real impressive backdrop that makes them unexpectedly contemporary in the visitor's eyes. Even the Pope, when he came here, John Paul II, was impressed. I could see it. I accompanied him right here, and he himself told us, continue the excavations. I said to him, Your Holiness, you are the first successor of Peter to have seen with your own eyes these steps, that oven, that wall, that threshold.
And we will need to turn our lights on. Thank you. Fascinating stuff, huh? Can you imagine telling the Pope? By the way, I discovered the house of the one you are the 264th successor. You know? That's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome. So we go into the octagonal church, which is the one of which we have more information. Somebody asked me why an octagonal church. It was a typical building during the Byzantine area, in this Byzantine time, because especially the buildings were built in an 8-shaped form, or 8 walls, to symbolize the day of the resurrection. So you have 7 days, and then a new Sunday, the one of the resurrection, that would be like the 8th day. For that reason, churches were shaped in that shape, symbolizing that new day, new Sunday, which is the one of the resurrection. As you can see, this is a picture, it's an old picture because the modern memorial is not there. So you have the house of Peter, here you have the synagogue, and here you have the rest of the village. And as you can see in this picture, the majority of the city had not been discovered yet. All right? Now, I find that fascinating because if the house of Peter is here and Jesus went and preached in the synagogue, they could have coffee and donuts after Saturday service at Pete's house. Just across the street. That's pretty practical. Jesus is very smart. This is another picture from above of the octagonal church. You can clearly see the shape. You can't miss it. This church was built in the 5th century. Clearly seen. And this is the view against the synagogue as a background behind. These are some of my pictures. Now there is a big structure on top, so you can't see us easily. But there are some of those walls, the entrance to the room. Another one as well. You can see the contrast here, the walls from the octagonal church, but the pavement from the 1st century. And this wall right here was part of the arch of the Domus Ecclesiae, or the house church. So you can see 3 layers right there at once. More walls. This is how you would see it if you go today. This picture is before the building. And the Franciscans have tried to reproduce the mosaics of the octagonal church as best as they were able. So they have put these platforms raised to the roof, to the level of the floor during this 5th century octagonal church. Everything below is before. So these are the mosaics. These are some examples of those mosaics with flowers, with round shapes. So it was a very well decorated church. Another view. And the pilgrim of Piacenza, we heard about it in the video. He visited, unlike Egeria, he visited almost 200 years after Egeria. So he couldn't find the Domus Ecclesiae, the house church, but he found the octagonal church. And that's what he describes. They came to Capharnaum in St. Peter's house, which at present is a basilica. And this is the new church, the one that is built on top of it. And as you can see, there is a big glass right at the center. That's why everybody can lean and look straight up, straight down. You will have the perspective of the 4 friends bringing down the parallel. That's why they built it in that way. That cool? It doesn't look like a church at all, to be honest with you, but it's perfect once you are inside because you can have that beautiful perspective from above. And it protects the ruins. The rest of the city is exposed to the elements. The house of Peter is not, so that's a good thing. Once again, the view of the church, the altar is at the end, and the tabernacle. And you have a 360-degree view of the surroundings. The house of Peter from above. This is with Bishop Siston. We're celebrating Mass with our pilgrimage in 2013. Oh, it's been 3 years already. Time flies. Here we have it. There is Deacon Al reading the gospel, and he's proclaiming the gospel of the bread of life discourse. And I have the conclusion of that, and you can hear it.
The bread that came down from heaven. Unlike your ancestors who ate and died, nonetheless, the man who feeds on this bread shall live forever. He said this in a synagogue instruction at Capharnaum. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise the Lord.
Not great? Yeah, and as you see, I immediately turn my camera towards the synagogue, which is across the street. You can actually see it through the glass. You know? All right. Once again, the house of Peter. I think I put a lot of pictures of the modern church. Peter's neighbors. And also from above, you can see the tomb of the other archaeologist that worked with Father Goffreda. The other archaeologist was Father Virgilio Corvo, and he died, and he was buried in the excavations. And that's amazing. What a great honor. You know, but you go forward. My respects to you. This is an opportunity when I had a chance to celebrate Mass there in Capharnaum. And once again, the view of Capharnaum from the sea. And now we turn to the synagogue, okay? We turn to the synagogue. Before showing the synagogue, you notice that the majority of the buildings in Capharnaum were made of black stone, right? So I brought a little sample right here. You know, suddenly this showed up in my luggage. Did you bring anything, any rocks? No? That's why we have the sacrament of reconciliation. Better to say sorry than to ask for permission. So, if you want to take a look at that rock, you can just come and see. It is from the Sea of Galilee.
Or you could steal it.
No, don't take it. Don't take it. We have cameras here. Interestingly enough, the synagogue is not made of black stone. Why? Because the current synagogue is not from Jesus' time. It is from the 4th century, as we heard. However, because of the work of the archaeologists, they have been able to identify that what lies below this 4th century synagogue is the actual structure of the previous synagogue, who happened to be built by the centurion of whom Jesus cured his slave. And so it is the same spot. We have a newer building on top of it, but it is the same spot of the synagogue. The previous synagogue must have also been built in the black stone of most of the buildings near the Sea of Galilee. The entrance of the synagogue has several columns. They have inscriptions of families that donated and paid for the column, just like what we have in our churches, little plaques, you know, the pew rental, that stuff. You know. They also had that. So, for example, this one says, Alphaeus, the son of Zebudan, the son of John, made this column. May it be for him a blessing. You know, dedication. The view of the synagogue from above the house of Peter. The entrance to the synagogue. There are even games on the pavement. No? This is the pavement of the courtyard of the synagogue. From inside, details. The detail in the stone is striking, it's amazing. That means that this was an important synagogue. The view of the synagogue is very clear from the water. You can see it right away. When he entered Capharnaum, a centurion approached him and appealed to him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, suffering dreadfully. So he said to him, I will come and cure him. The centurion said in reply, Lord, I am not worthy to have you enter under my roof. Only say the word and my servant will be healed. We say this every Sunday at Mass. So we refer to this event that took place in Capharnaum. You'll remember this next time you go to Mass. And once again, the wonderful view of the octagonal church and the synagogue. Notice, the synagogue had, this part was the actual synagogue temple, you want to call it. This part here was the courtyard, so there was an open area. Once again, this was the body of the synagogue, and then on the right side there was a courtyard, open area. So it was like this, pretty much like this. This is the main room. All the columns in this room, they all have dedicatories for the people that paid for them. So the main room would have looked like this. Very likely it had 2 floors. So it was a rather big building. But remember, this is the 4th century. This is not the one of Jesus' time yet. Another view. This is probably from an old postcard. That wasn't fun to see. There are details in the stones. For example, here is the place where this is like a representation of the place where they will store the Torah, the sacred writings. But it was represented in the carvings of the decorations of the synagogue. There are plenty of remains of the synagogue all over the place. Now, we heard on the video also about the Via Maris, this important highway that connected Damascus with Egypt. So here is a representation of this way, and certainly Capharnaum is right there, right there. How do we know that the Via Maris was going through this particular town? Because they found a milestone. Not a milestone of an achievement, but a milestone actually showing that this is a mile. And from this stone to the next one is another mile. And the Romans, they built a very unique system of roads, and they had everything marked very well. So that when you would reach a milestone, then you would know how many miles or how many days, how many hours you would have to walk to get to your next destination. And you knew if you were going to have a supply of water, if you were going to have food for your animals, so you have to think about fuel, you know, you have to refill the tank of the camel. And so all of that was well preserved by the Romans. They did a fascinating job at communications. And so the milestone has been found in Capharnaum. That means that the road went to Capharnaum. So it's just fascinating to see that. All right. I think at this point, okay, this is another one of the milestone. And I think at this point, miraculously, I will open the floor for questions. I always run out of time, but this time has been just perfect. So if anybody will have any questions I would like to make, otherwise I will point out to some of the biblical texts. Please.
Were the kitchens in the courtyard?
Were the kitchens in the courtyard? Yes. They were mostly open fire and maybe a little roof nearby, but for the most part we're in an open area. Yeah.
Is there any idea of the population at the time?
The population of the time, yes. It says that, according to some sources, during the Byzantine time, that would have been about the 4th century. It says that it had about 1,500 people. Sounds very small, right? Sounds very small, but this wouldn't be the time of Jesus. So in the time of Jesus, we're not sure how many people were actually there. And considering that a lot more houses need to be discovered, we cannot estimate that yet. Yeah. Yes?
Were there cisterns in the ruins, or did they just get the water?
There is a description that I would like to read. You just brought, your questions are bringing this description of the houses. I'm going to read straight from Father Lofreda, who is the one that was in the video. This is what he says. The private houses so far excavated are rather unpretentious, but by no means poor, at least according to the living standard of ancient village. They also betray no sharp economic differentiation. Local volcanic basalt stones in the natural state were used to build walls and pavements. Walls were built without true foundations, and the one-story rooms could hardly reach more than 3 meters in height, judging from several staircases leading to the roof. Fairly regular courses were leveled with the small pebbles and soil, but with no help of a strong mortar. at least in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Even in the Byzantine period, mortar was employed only in some cases and not as a rule. Light roofs were made up of wooden beams and of beaten earth mixed with straw covered the squat rooms, and they were reached from open courtyards through a flight of stone steps. The private houses consisted of several units following a fairly standard pattern with minor differences. Several roof rooms clustered around a large open courtyard. Actually, the open courtyard was the focal point of a house. Its conspicuous size in comparison to the small roofed rooms was dictated by the climatic conditions of Capharnaum, where in summertime the temperature lingers around 35 degrees. That would be Celsius. So that would be probably high 90s, okay? The squat roofed rooms received light from a series of windows facing the inner courtyard. They were used as shelters for sleeping, at least in the rainy season, and as a place where the inhabitants kept their belongings, whereas many daily life activities took place in the courtyard. Grinding stones and ovens, for instance, are always found in the courtyard. Here women fixed the meal. Here the artisans worked, and probably here too people used to sleep in the summertime on stretched mats on the floor. Hygienic facilities such as washrooms, drainage systems did not exist. Neither can we find in Capharnaum water cisterns, nor in Chorazin, which is another town, or underground silos, as we find in Nazareth, he said. Well, Nazareth was far away from water. A general layout of the houses by no means conveys an image of a rural settlement. To the contrary, we can visualize a large village where merchants, artisans, farmers, and fishermen built their dwellings according to a harmonious plan. So this city was planned. It just didn't happen. It didn't just happen. It was a well-planned city. But since the water was so close, they didn't need to have any of that. Yes?
Were there like stores or exchange when this?
Absolutely, yes. There is evidence of stores, shops, and all that. And that's true in most of the large cities. In Jerusalem as well, plenty of shops.
Have they found any boats or ships along the way?
If they have found any boats or ships along the way, and the answer is yes. Just only a few miles near Magdala, so 4 or 5 miles from here, they found a boat from the 1st century. That boat is called the Jesus boat. Even though we don't know if it belonged to Jesus, but who knows? Maybe. I'm going to show you the Jesus boat, since you asked the question. Jesus boat. That's as easy as that is. And it was underground, it was under the soil, under the water. Okay? And in order to take it out, this is wood that has been wet for 2,000 years. So they had to build this structure around the wood with foam in order to take it, so that because when the wood would get in contact with the oxygen outside the water, it would just fall apart like dust. So that's why they had to take it out in this special foam structure. Once it was out, they started a long process, I think of about 2 years, of drying the wood little by little. Literally, the archaeologists have to be with their spray bottles, the ones that you use to get your hair done. They have to be pushing that thing to keep it wet. In order to finally to dry it completely. And now a museum is built around the boat, and this is called the Jesus boat in the Holy Land. Great question. Yes. It's not in Capharnaum, that's why I wasn't showing. It is only a few miles from Capharnaum, though. Yes. Any other question?
How did Jesus spend his time there?
How did Jesus spend this time? We need to read the Gospels then. Especially Mark. If you read Mark, you will notice that the poor Jesus never rested. I dare you to read the first chapter of Mark. And you will see that Jesus is pretty much like Mother Teresa. Like going from one place to another, and then went from here, left to here, left there. It's unbelievable. He was so busy. Yeah? And then also you can take time to read the gospel versions where the word Capharnaum appears in the gospel. I copied them all. Now, there are several more events that took place in Capharnaum, but the city is not mentioned by name. But we know it's the city. Those are not included here. Okay? So here is only the events that took place in Capharnaum. That it says Capharnaum. Sorry.
The area seems so mostly unpopulated.
Yes.
Is it, there's just nothing?
Is the area mostly unpopulated to this day? Correct. Yes. Except for few resorts here and there. The city of Tiberias continues being a city. There are a lot of hotels over there. But for the most part, the area is quite unpopulated. Which, once again, for the archaeologists, that's a plus. It's unbelievably good.
Can you walk around?
Can you walk around? Yes, you can walk around. There is very rare public transportation in the area.
I mean, in there.
Like in the temple.
In the temple.
And you mean in the synagogue? Yeah, you can walk all of this, yes.
Okay.
All of this, you can walk. Yeah, most of my pictures don't have people, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's because I always stay in the back of the group. And whenever there was no people, I immediately take a picture. I'm good for two kinds of pictures. Panoramic pictures, and selfies. But I didn't need to have a selfie for there was a hand over here. Yes.
What is that large building in the far corner?
Oh, okay, great question. What is this large building in this corner? That's the convent of the Franciscans. Yeah, that is the convent of the Franciscans, yes. And the retreat house where I stayed was beyond. It was about 2 miles from here in Tabga. And so we walked there every day to go back and forth. It was just so awesome. It was great. Yeah. Yes, there is a question on it.
Are they going to continue to excavate?
If they are going to continue to excavate, my gut feeling is not for the next time. Maybe down the road. Many of these Franciscans are aging. All those great archaeologists are pretty much gone. And with the few that they have, they are still trying to keep the school, the Franciscan school in Jerusalem. It's called the Studium Biblicum Franciscanum. And so those teachers are like quite old by now. Yeah, they're quite old. I don't know what to say. And the new Franciscans are more interested in other things. So far for the meantime, I don't think so. But hopefully they do.
The Franciscans that did the excavation, did they come from Europe or where?
They're from Italy. They're all Italians.
Oh.
Yeah, all. They were great teachers, I'm telling you. Very excited. They used their hands to tell the extent. You probably saw it in Father Rufreda, yes.
Who actually owns the property?
Who owns the property? Well, the property belongs to the state of Israel. However, it's been under the Franciscan care since the time of St. Francis. Okay? St. Francis visited the Sultan of Egypt, who at the time governed the entire Holy Land. We're talking about the 13th, 14th century. And the Sultan there was very impressed to see a Christian not in armor. You know what I'm saying? And so he was very impressed by that. And because of this conversation that the Sultan and Francis had, the Sultan allowed the Franciscans to enter to take place of the Christian holy places. So the Franciscans are for more than 7 centuries, taking care of the biblical sites. And so many of these places that we visit in the Holy Land, you will always see Franciscans. They are amazing. I really pray for them, because they have to go through a lot in order to keep these places going, so that we can visit. There are a couple of things.
What has kept the sea so unpopulated as far as tourism and putting big hotels up?
It's a pretty contentious area. Right north of Galilee, there are the Golan Heights. This is a disputed area. Syria says that it belongs to them, and Israel says it belongs to them. After they went on the Six-Day War and bombarded them and took all the place. But there is a lot of tension in the farther north part of the Galilee. Before the creation of the State of Israel, 1948 or 46, before that, there were only very small Palestinian villages. So there was not really a big reason to have big populations around the Sea of Galilee. But now it is used more for recreational purposes and archaeology, basically. I don't know what else to say. Yeah. There was another question?
I just wondered what happened to them. I mean, if it was such a, place to be, what happened?
What happened? Okay, what happened to Capharnaum if it was such a place to be, why it became abandoned? Well, that's because when the Arabs came, the Muslim invasion came to the Holy Land in the 7th century, then the population started to be reduced. There was no interest for Jews or for Christians to be there because all the towns were becoming Muslim. So gradually they were abandoned. When the Crusaders came to the Holy Land, many people talk about how horrible the Crusaders were. Well, honestly, the Crusaders lost the battle. They lost it. I mean, they kept the Holy Land maybe for 100 years, and then the Muslims came back and took them out. So there is no glorious story really in the Crusaders. And the Crusaders were talking about 1100 AD. So after that, they were just small villages. How's the fishing in the Sea of Galilee? You have to go and get the St. Peter's fish. There is a restaurant only a mile from this place. They call the St. Peter's fish. Basically, it's a tilapia, okay? And most of them are farm raised. There is still fishing in the Sea of Galilee. In fact, there are some fishermen that work very early in the Sea of Galilee, but it is not like massive production or no, it is more individuals that go and do fishing. They try to preserve it as much as possible.
What about mountains or wilderness where the Bible says Jesus would go off? Where would that be in relation to this?
Anything beyond the Sea of Galilee. Look at your map in the back. You see the 3D version of it? It's all surrounded with mountains. And don't forget that the Sea of Galilee is, I think, 200 or 300 feet below the sea level.
How far would that have been, like, to walk into?
Right there. There are the mountains right there.
Okay.
Next, fresh water, yes. And don't forget, next time that you go to the lake, the Sea of Galilee looks exactly the same. The only difference is that in the Sea of Galilee, you can see the other side, and it's also surrounded by hills. Yeah. It is really beautiful.
Can you mention why storms are so big on the lake?
Why storms are so big in the lake? I don't know why storms are so big in the lake, but they are quite often. They happen often. It happened to me once. We were in the middle of the water, and suddenly all these birds begin to fly over us. And the one who was guiding us said, "Oh, we better get out." And we're like, "Come on, we just got here. We want to take some pictures." "No, we better get out." So we got out, and it got really wild. It just happens. I mean, it is very common. And another common thing in the Holy Land, in the Sea of Galilee, is these sky windows. And when you have these clouds, and suddenly it opens up, and you have this special lighting. You can see it on this picture right here. Very common, happens all the time. That's how I imagine the description of the baptism of Jesus. And the heavens broke open, and the voice of the Father came, and the Holy Spirit. There was another hand.
Do you know how deep the lake is?
No, I don't know how deep the lake is. No, I don't know. I'm sorry about that.
often is Mass celebrated at the new church?
How often is Mass celebrated in the new church? I would imagine they probably have from 5 to 12 Masses every day. Because there are groups coming every single day. Yeah, and booking a Mass there is kind of hard. Unless you're friends with the sacristan. That's the best, to be friends with the sacristan. That's pretty cool. I even got some of their cell phones, so okay. Don't mess with your sacristan. I didn't know the secretary, otherwise I wouldn't mess with the secretary either. But that's what it is. Well, it is exactly 2 hours. How exciting. And I hope you enjoy Capharnaum, and I am going to conclude. And I'm going to conclude with a portion of the Bread of Life Discourse, which is on the 3rd page. It's John 6. I am going to start John 6, verse 44. Verse 44. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. From the Gospel according to John. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draw him, and I will raise him on the last day. It is written in the prophets, they shall all be taught by God. Everyone who listens to my Father and learns from him comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father except the one who is from God. He has seen the Father. Amen, amen, I say to you. Whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate manna in the desert, but they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh for the life of the world. The Jews quarreled among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? And Jesus said to them, amen, amen, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you do not have life within you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Just as the living Father sent me, and I have life because of the Father, so also the one who feeds on me will have life because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. And like your ancestors who ate and still die, whoever eats this bread will live forever. These things he said while teaching in the synagogue in Capharnaum. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Please join me in thanking Father and Holy Spirit.